Hey everyone, my name is Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of The Friendly Mind, a free weekly newsletter where I share practical, evidence-based advice for emotional health and well-being. And today, we're going to be talking about anger. Specifically, I'm going to share 4 of the biggest myths and misconceptions about anger, because if you want to be able to handle your anger in a healthier, more productive way, you have to understand how it really works. All right, let's dive in. Number 1, anger is not a negative emotion. It's a pleasurable one. Now, if you give people a list of emotions and say, all right, sort these emotions into 2 buckets, positive emotions and negative emotions, what you're going to get is you're going to get a lot of emotions going into the negative bucket, things like sadness, anxiety, grief, regret, shame, stuff like that. And then you're going to get a few that are going to go in the positive bucket, things like joy or happiness or love, things like that. And what you'll find, though, is when you do this exercise, anger inevitably gets put into the negative emotion bucket. Of course, in reality, no emotion is negative or positive in the sense of being good or bad. Emotions can't be good or bad because they're not things we have direct control over. There's no happiness dial you can just adjust to feel happier, or an anxiety lever you can just pull down to feel less anxious, right? So it doesn't make sense to think of things as moral, as good or bad, if we don't have direct control over them. But even if you accept that, a lot of people will still classify emotions in terms of negative and positive based on how they feel. Right? And they'll say things like, well, anxiety is a negative emotion because it feels bad. It's uncomfortable, painful even, just like sadness or shame. And so is anger. But in reality, I don't think that's the case. And in fact, I think anger feels good. Now, that might sound a little crazy, so let me explain myself a bit. Most people, I think, classify anger as a feel bad emotion because they associate it with a lot of things that either are bad or feel bad. For instance, behaviors. A lot of the behaviors that immediately follow from anger, we typically call these aggressive behaviors, literally are bad. And then we feel bad after we do them sometimes, right? So if you push someone or you punch someone, right? That is a bad aggressive behavior. So you can judge that as bad, and you're probably going to feel negative as a result of doing that. Certainly other people are going to. Also, thoughts, in particular self-judgments or self-criticisms. A lot of times anger is tied up with self-criticism. So the minute we start feeling angry, we start judging ourselves or getting critical of ourselves for feeling angry. And so again, there's that guilt by association. Is it the anger that felt bad? Or was it the guilt and sadness that came immediately afterwards because we started judging ourselves for feeling angry? So be careful. There's physical behaviors associated with anger. There are mental behaviors, especially things like self-judgment or self-criticism. And then the other part of this is when we get angry, often other people's reaction to our anger is very negative and feels bad. So again, because of all 3 of these kind of phenomenon that like orbit anger, we tend to do this guilt by association thing and assume anger itself is bad or negative. Feels negative. But I think, and I'm going to put this to you, a challenge. You don't have to take my word for it right now, but I'm going to give you a challenge to think about. The next time you feel angry, really try to pause in the moment and ask yourself, this feeling I'm feeling right now, the feeling itself, is this bad? Does it feel negative? Or actually, does it feel kind of good? I think what you'll find is that the emotion itself of anger, if you separate it out from all the other negative things that tend to go along with it, behaviors, thoughts, other people's reactions, stuff like that, I think what you'll find is that anger actually feels pretty good. It feels pleasurable. It's enjoyable. Now, more than just kind of a curious or interesting observation about the psychology of anger, this idea that anger is actually a pleasurable, enjoyable emotion, it really matters in a very practical way. And the reason for this is pretty straightforward, but we don't think about it a lot. Often, we unintentionally do things and get in the habit of doing things that perpetuate and even aggravate our anger. So in other words, we do a lot of stuff that sustains our anger precisely because anger feels good, right? And so we get in the habit of doing things that perpetuate that state of feeling good. In the moment, at least. Long term, that's another question, whether kind of keeping ourselves perpetually angry is actually good for us or enjoyable. So one of the forms this takes in our lives is what I think of as the anger as self-esteem booster dynamic. Now, the way this looks is a lot of people who struggle with low self-esteem or low self-worth, they pick up this habit, and it's not intentional. I think they pick it up along the way of life. They're trying their best. But anyway, people with low self-esteem oftentimes, not always, but often pick up this habit of being hypercritical of other people. When you're critical of other people, when you judge someone else, by default, you are boosting your own self-esteem by comparison. So for instance, when you criticize someone else for being dumb, what you're really sort of implying is, and I'm smart, right? Or when you criticize someone else for being bad, what you're implying is, but I'm good. Like I see the light. I see the way things should be. In other words, when you are hypercritical of other people, this produces some anger that actually boosts your self-esteem temporarily in the very short term. And that's really critical. But because that good feeling, that anger, that positive sense of self-righteousness, it temporarily suppresses the low self-esteem and makes us feel better. It's rewarding, feels good. So we keep doing things that we learn lead to it, like self-criticism, right? Now, the other form that this take, that kind of anger as a pleasurable experience, that one of the other reasons it sticks around is because anger also helps to alleviate another really uncomfortable experience, which is helplessness. Feeling helpless is awful. In fact, I would almost argue it's one of the worst feelings. It's one of the ones people will do almost anything to get out of feeling helpless, including, I would argue, making themselves and keeping themselves angry. Often kind of unintentionally, but that's what's going on under the hood. So a really common example of this is people who are news junkies, who just watch tons and tons and tons of news. Now, often these people they care a lot about politics and social issues and things like that. But for whatever reason, for a variety of reasons, they don't actually get involved and actually do anything to make politics or, our social lives better. They kind of sit around and watch a lot of news, consume a lot of news, watch a lot of TV, social media, whatever, but they're not actually doing anything. They're not actually making change out there in the world. And I think probably on some level they feel kind of guilty about that. But here's the thing about consuming a lot of news. It usually makes you really angry, right? Because what you're basically doing some version of, look at all those idiots out there, right? They're so dumb, they're so bad, they're so whatever. And again, when you do that, what you're implying is, but I'm so smart. Like I'm so right. I'm so righteous. I know what's really going on. I know the way things should be. And that feels good. And it feels good in the sense specifically of it superficially makes you feel like you're doing something. You're confronting the issue. You're addressing the issue by consuming and thinking about it. But that's kind of a cheap, superficial way of thinking about the term addressing. Are you actually addressing the issue, or are you just spending time around it, thinking about it, getting kind of frustrated and angry about it? Those are very different things. But psychologically, that anger that comes from watching the news, right, it serves the purpose of alleviating that helplessness. And so it sticks around because we learn if we watch a lot of news, we're going to get kind of angry and be that self-righteousness, that positive feeling that comes with anger is going to come up, and it's going to alleviate that helplessness or maybe even the guilt that goes along with caring a lot about political and social issues, say, but not actually doing anything about them. Okay? So that's another place where this idea that anger is actually a pleasurable experience, where it comes in, and you can see why it really matters. So to kind of sum all this up, it's important to acknowledge that anger is actually a pleasurable emotion. It's an enjoyable, rewarding experience because it helps explain and make sense of this almost paradoxical thing where people who have a lot of chronic anger, it seems like they keep themselves angry all the time. They're doing things that continue to trigger that anger, like watching the news or criticizing people or complaining or things like that. And the key is that anger, it's doing something. It's doing a job for them. Now, long term, it's probably not very helpful, but in the short term, it is. So if you struggle with chronic anger, one of the best things you can do is really make some time to reflect carefully on the following question, or set of questions, I would say, which is, why might I want to get angry? What job is anger doing for me? Right? What psychological need does anger fill? If you really make some time to honestly ask yourselves those questions, I think you're going to be well on your way to actually addressing chronic anger issues. And really, it's one of the most powerful skills for emotional health there is, which is to learn how to treat our emotions functionally, not morally. Instead of just assuming, oh, anger, that thing's bad, or sadness, that's bad, anxiety, that's bad, I gotta get rid of it, or joy, that's good, I need to have more joy in my life. No. Think about them mechanically or functionally. They're doing something, they're doing a job. And when you learn to think about your emotions functionally, you tend to be able to respond to them in a much healthier and more productive way. Number 2, anger is not the same as aggression. This is maybe the most important distinction you need to understand about anger, which is anger is an emotion, whereas aggression is a behavior. And really understanding this difference is absolutely critical to learning how to respond and deal with your anger in a healthier way. So let me give you some examples to illustrate this distinction, because it's you hear it intellectually and it sort of makes sense, but it can be very subtle and hard to grok in the moment. So for instance, let's say you're playing pickup basketball with your buddies and someone shoves you, fouls you hard, and you fall over. You feel angry, and then immediately, impulsively, you sort of shove them back. So that shoving back, that's an aggressive behavior. That's a physical behavior. It's different, though, than feeling angry when the person shoved you. Another one, maybe you're sitting in a meeting at work, and after presenting something, an idea, a coworker makes sort of a sarcastic comment under their breath. And you feel angry, understandably, about that. And then you launch a little zinger right back at them. You make a really quippy remark, sarcastic remark right back to them. Now, what's key, the emotion you felt after they made the nasty comment about you, that's different than your verbal behavior of making a sarcastic comment back at them. So that's aggression. It's different than the emotion of anger. Or just another quick example, you walk in the kitchen and you realize that your spouse yet again has left their dishes all over the table and hasn't put them away in the sink, despite the fact that you've talked to them multiple times about this. So you feel angry. There's the emotion. But then immediately, it almost feels simultaneous to that, you start ruminating on what, unthoughtful and insensitive Neanderthal your husband is, right? And you start playing back all sorts of memories about how they've done similar things like this, and all those times you've told them you want them to stop. And that rumination is a form of mental aggression. And it's related to, certainly, but distinct from the emotion of anger you felt initially. Now, the reason this distinction between the emotion of anger and the behavior of aggression matters so much has to do with the really important concept of control. Now, we alluded to this earlier, but you can't control any emotion directly, including anger. Again, there's no button you can press to just be happier, right? Or a little slider you can pull down to not feel so sad or to not feel so guilty or whatever it is. This is not how emotions work. They don't work that way. And because of that, we can't be morally responsible for them. If you think about it, we all know this intuitively. Embedded in our legal system, and in every legal system I've ever heard about across the world, you can't be condemned or sent to prison for feeling really angry. No one gets sentenced to prison for getting super angry or getting mad or feeling rageful even, right? What do you get sent to prison for? You get sent to prison for your behavior, for your actions. So you got angry and then, you got in a fist fight with someone in the bar. That's what gets you into trouble, because that's what you're morally responsible for. You are morally responsible for your behavior because you have direct control over your behavior, not your emotions. Now, in the context of anger and someone who has chronic anger issues, this control idea is really important because most people get the relationship between kind of emotions and control backwards. What I mean by that is they try to control the emotion of anger. And as a result of that, they put all their energy and time and effort into the anger, which doesn't work. You can't control it, right? And then they have no energy left to handle the thing they actually can control, which is the aggression, the behavior. And again, whether that's physical aggression behavior, whether that's verbal aggression behavior, or even mental aggression or behavior in your head. So there's opportunity cost here. When you're trying to control something you can't control, you have less energy left over to control the things you actually can control. And in the context of anger, that's your aggressive impulses. The trick is to flip the strategy. Don't worry too much about the emotion itself of anger, and instead put your energy and focus onto the unhelpful behaviors, whatever form your aggression tends to take. Now, the way I like to think about this is you want to briefly is the key word here, briefly acknowledge and validate your anger. And then once you've done that, and it can take 5 seconds, I'll talk about what it looks like in a second, then put your effort into not acting on the anger if it's going to be unhelpful, controlling the aggression. So what does it mean to acknowledge and validate your anger? Very simply, it's just a little bit of self-talk where you said, okay, you're saying this to yourself in your head. I'm feeling really angry right now. And that's okay. It makes sense that I would feel angry after so-and-so did XYZ. Right? That's it. What did that take? 5 seconds? Maybe? So you're just acknowledging to yourself that you're angry, and then you're reminding yourself that it's valid. It's okay to feel this way. It's understandable that I'm angry. Now, the reason that's really important is because when you validate an emotion, it actually kind of takes some of the pressure off of that emotion. You're going to be less impulsive and reactive if you validated it first. So really, the key to controlling your aggression, which is the thing you actually can't control, is to get very good, very skilled at quickly and deftly acknowledging and validating that anger, and then moving on to figuring out how to control the aggressive impulses, okay? So remember, you want to validate the anger and control the behavior. Validate the anger, control the behavior. Number 3, things don't cause anger. Thoughts about things cause anger. So everybody gets angry, right? It's a perfectly normal human emotion. Whether you like it or not is almost beside the point. It's very normal and it's understandable. It's even helpful in a lot of situations to get angry. However, some people get either extremely angry sometimes, or they're kind of constantly pretty angry, or at least mildly angry. And occasionally both. Some people are just like kind of chronically angry and periodically get super angry, to the point where it's sort of out of proportion to their circumstances. And either you know that, or you've gotten feedback from reliable people in your life that like, hey, this anger, like you're constantly kind of angry, or the way you explode sometimes. I get it, we all feel angry, but it seems disproportionate to what actually happened. So if you struggle with chronic anger like that, either because it's like constant or because it really blows up occasionally, what that means is that you have a problematic relationship with your anger. Now, note that I didn't say your anger was a problem. It's not. No matter how intense or how chronic your anger is, the anger itself is not a problem. Emotions are never problems. How you behave in response to that anger, like yelling at people or getting physical with people or ruminating obsessively about something, that might be a problem for sure. Your mindset and kind of erroneous beliefs about your own anger might be a problem, contributing to even more anger. But anger itself is never a problem. This is really important to understand. You got to take a second and internalize that. Anger itself is not bad. How you respond to it can be bad. What you do afterward can be bad. Even how you think in response to anger can potentially be bad or unhelpful. But the emotion of anger itself is not bad or dangerous at all. Still, it's important to acknowledge that chronic anger can be contributing to other problems in your life. So if you're frequently just really angry and irritable at work, for instance, it's going to make it really hard for other people to work with you and even to trust you. And therefore, like your effectiveness, your team's effectiveness, even your organization's effectiveness might sink because of your relationship with your anger and how you manage it and how you express it and deal with it. Or maybe, for instance, you have frequent, or maybe not even frequent, maybe you just have really infrequent but intense outbursts of anger in your romantic relationships. And for a variety of reasons, this may be really problematic for your spouse or partner. Or maybe, I don't know, it could just be more general. Maybe you sort of realize on some almost existential level, like, hey, going through life chronically angry is just really not working for me anymore. So it can be problematic in the big sense of the word. The specific emotion itself is not a problem, but all the stuff that gets wrapped up in chronic anger can definitely be contributing to problems in your life. But regardless, you don't want to, as the old saying goes, shoot the messenger. Anger is the emotion. You can think of anger as it's like a messenger. It's trying to tell you something. Now, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true, maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not helpful. But regardless, anger is just a signal from your body trying to tell you something. It's not bad itself, even if you don't like the message. So don't shoot the messenger. Don't start getting critical and judgmental about your anger. Because if for no other reason, like obviously, that's just going to lead to you be even more angry. So don't shoot the messenger. In almost all cases, the real problem you need to address, well, really there's two. We're going to talk about the second one later on in the fourth point. But the first big problem around anger is not anger itself. It's your thoughts. It's your thought patterns, your way of thinking after you feel angry. So in almost all cases, the real problem, the thing that actually needs to be addressed when people have anger issues or struggle with chronic anger, it's not the emotion itself, it's their thinking. Because the direct cause of all emotions, including anger, is thinking. So just some examples to kind of illustrate this. When someone cuts you off on the freeway, did the car moving in front of you cause you to be angry? No, definitely not. It's your story about what being cut off means that led to you feeling angry. It's what you told yourself in your head. Or if you are, you get into an argument with your spouse or your partner and they're being overly critical to you and you feel angry. Are the words coming out of their mouths making you angry? No, of course not. It's your interpretation of what those words mean. It's how you're thinking about what they're saying that leads to you feeling angry. Or if you at work, let's say one of your teammates constantly shows up late to work. Is them showing up late making you angry? Mm-mm. It's the fact that you start ruminating as soon as you realize it's 2 after the hour and Bob's late again for the meeting, and you start ruminating about all the times in the past he's been late and how annoying it is and how we're not going to have enough time to get the meeting, everything we need to get done in the meeting, blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. That's what's making you angry. Bob not showing up didn't make you angry. So things don't cause emotions. It's our thoughts about things that leads to how we feel emotionally. This is crucial to understand because what it means is if you struggle with anger, it's not the anger you need to deal with, it's the thoughts preceding the anger that you want to get a handle on. So like personally, and I've worked with a lot of folks with chronic anger issues, I've never met an angry person who wasn't a chronic ruminator as well. Just like I've never met someone with road rage who wasn't constantly in the habit of criticizing other drivers. I've never met a chronically frustrated person who didn't have extraordinarily unrealistic expectations for other people. So the point of this is, if you want to feel less angry, you need to address the mental habits that are generating that anger in the first place. And when it comes to the mental habits that generate anger, there are two culprits that are by far the biggest and most common offenders. And they are rumination. Rumination is the tendency to dwell on other people's kind of faults or bad behaviors. It involves a lot of rehashing of old memories. That's a really common. When we say, stop dwelling on something, that's the technical term for that is rumination. You're ruminating unhelpfully on negative things or perceived negative things that have happened, usually things that have happened to you or to people or things you care about. Okay, so that's rumination. The key is that it's unhelpful negative thinking. The other one is expectations. Expectations are essentially stories or rules you have about how other people should act or behave or how other things should go. So they're essentially should statements. And when your expectations are incredibly unrealistic, it tends to lead to just a lot of chronic frustration, anger, and especially resentment. If you struggle with resentment, if that's kind of your flavor of anger that you really struggle with, it's almost always an expectations issue. For whatever reason, you've got really unrealistic expectations, usually of people in your life. So when you find yourself getting really angry, a really helpful question to ask yourself is, what are the thoughts generating this anger? What mental habits or patterns in myself are leading to me feeling this angry? And then once you've done that as a next step, and this is pretty next level, but if you can get there, it's really helpful. Instead of going to, well, is that true or false? Are these thoughts true or false or correct or incorrect? Instead, just ask yourself, is this way of thinking, is this thought, is this belief, is this expectation, is it helpful? Is it helpful to me? Is thinking like this actually doing any good to me? And I think you'll be very surprised if you ask yourself that honestly, what comes up for you. Number 4, venting makes you more angry, not less. So there's this idea that's been floating around in our culture for 150 years probably, that when you feel angry, you need to express or release or vent the anger, or else it'll become somehow kind of toxic and dangerous. Now, this has been around since the days of Freud, right? Really early on in the study of psychology. And it's not a crazy idea, but the trouble with it is It's just not true. Research consistently shows that the cathartic theory of anger, the idea that you need to express or ruminate on your anger in order to sort of release it somehow, it doesn't work. It doesn't make you less angry. In fact, it makes you more angry. So now you might be, careful listeners will be saying to themselves at this point, but didn't you just say earlier on that it's a good idea to actually acknowledge and validate your anger? Yes, I absolutely did say that. But there is a really subtle but critical distinction between validating your anger and venting about your anger. And the primary way we distinguish venting from validation is through motivation. What's the motivation behind it? Both venting and validation are behaviors. They're things we do in response to anger, but our motivation behind them is very different. So with venting, the motivation behind venting is always to feel better ourselves. So this is why, for instance, venting almost always, at least eventually, takes the form of complaining, usually about other people. So you're venting about your obnoxious coworker or boss, or the insensitive husband, or the parents who didn't, show enough affection when you were young, or whatever it is. We do this because, like we talked about earlier, when we criticize other people, we temporarily boost our own ego. Anger actually feels good. That self-righteousness that goes with anger feels good. It's an ego boost. And again, remember, I'm not saying we do this intentionally necessarily. Often this venting or complaining or criticizing is just a habit that we've gotten into. But like all habits, if you become more aware of them, you can learn to stop doing them if they're not helping. Right? And I think when it comes to venting, even though in the very short term, it does feel good, like so many things in life that superficially feel good in the moment, they can often be pretty problematic and harmful in the long term. And if you struggle with chronic anger, either of the sort of like slow burn, just kind of constantly irritable, or the really explosive outbursts of anger, in either case, a big part of what's driving and maintaining that anger is this habit of venting, which is tough because a lot of people think, because my field for so long has kind of promulgated the idea that you need to vent your anger in order to deal with it in a healthy way. It's actually totally backwards. You do not need to vent your anger, and it actually makes it more intense. So, what you do need to do, not only if you need to do it, but it's very helpful if you do it, is this habit that we talked about of validation. Now, with validation, the motivation behind validation is not to feel better in the moment. The motivation with validation is to do better. Validation is focused actually on the actions you end up taking. So when we validate an emotion like anger, we say, hey, you know what? It's okay. I feel angry. It's normal. It's understandable to feel this way, even though I don't like it, or even though other people don't like it. It's okay. And now I'm going to move on. I'm going to get on with my life. I'm going to get back to doing X, or I'm going to address Y, So validation isn't fundamentally about you and how you feel. Now, it happens to have the nice side effect of it does kind of take the edge off whatever emotion you're validating, including anger. So if you validate yourself, you will usually feel a little less angry. But the core motivation behind validation is not to stay obsessed with your anger and focused on your anger and all the people, associated with it. The point of validation is so that you can move on from your anger and get back to life, like doing stuff. So venting keeps you a prisoner to your anger. Validation frees you from it. Now, before we wrap up, there's another element of venting that I want to talk about, because I think it's really common, but we just miss it. A lot of people don't see it. And that is that venting is often a form of procrastination. Now, maybe it sounds strange, right? But when you are venting and kind of obsessing over some person or thing that made you angry, even though things don't actually make you angry, remember, it's your thoughts about things that make you angry. In any case, when you're venting or complaining or ruminating, any of these like unhelpful ways of thinking about your anger or what caused your anger, what you're actually doing is avoiding doing the hard work, the difficult work, the often slow work of actually addressing problems in your life. So a few examples, like let's say this happens at work a lot of the time, but let's say you are venting with some coworkers about your boss who's kind of a little flighty and lacks focus, and you think this is really holding back your team. So you're kind of venting and complaining. You're not saying anything like super nasty. You're not being even mean necessarily, but you're doing like the typical kind of like complain a little bit about your boss thing. We've all been there, right? The thing is, the more insidious thing behind this habit that makes it problematic, I think, is that it superficially makes you feel like you're doing something. Again, you're in that shallow way, you are addressing the problem. It allows you to avoid the actual problem, which is your boss does maybe lack a lot of focus, and maybe they need to know that for your team to be successful, you need to focus more. The trouble is, to actually address the real problem with your boss, you would have to have a pretty potentially difficult, awkward, uncomfortable conversation. And maybe that's just kind of intimidating or just unpleasant sounding. Like, I don't want to do it. Like, that would take a lot of work and it could be really uncomfortable. And like, addressing it through venting, frankly, is just more fun and easier and not a big deal. So we fall into this trap of procrastinating on the real issue by using venting as an excuse because it superficially feels productive. Or another one might be, another example I used to see a lot is, you're venting to your best friend about how emotionally unavailable your partner is. And again, the avoidance mechanism here is that the real problem is your relationship with your partner. Like, you need to have a conversation. You need to have a good, assertive conversation with your partner about your emotional needs in the relationship. No amount of venting to your best friend is going to address that issue. That's really important to see, but it can sort of make you feel like you're addressing it in a very superficial way if you don't think too hard about it. And so it keeps us from dealing with the main issue. So just like you don't want to use obsessing over your anger as a way to avoid looking at the mental habits that are generating the anger in the first place, similarly, you also don't want to use venting and kind of stewing and obsessing over your anger as a way to avoid taking action, assertive action on the real problems in your life. Something I used to tell my clients all the time was that no amount of emotional processing will make up for a lack of assertiveness in your life. And what I mean by assertiveness is, some people think of assertiveness as kind of this like cheap communication technique where you get kind of like super confident and like, no. Assertiveness just means you are asking for or going after the things that really matter in your life, despite the fact that they feel uncomfortable or afraid, right? So it could be setting a boundary or asking for what you really want or having a difficult conversation. Whatever it is, it's doing the thing that's important despite feeling afraid or uncomfortable about it. And a lot of times, if you have chronic sort of unrelenting anger issues, one of the ways to think about that as it means something in your life, there's some structural thing going on in your life. It's usually a relationship that needs work. It needs to be actually addressed. And you don't want to fall into this pattern of avoiding addressing the actual issue by venting or stewing or complaining or otherwise obsessing over the anger itself. All right, so to sum up what we've talked about here, the key idea, I think, is that most people who struggle with chronic anger, they do so because they don't actually understand how anger works on a psychological level. So if you struggle with anger issues, a really good first step is to get clear on the underlying dynamics of anger and kind of reverse some of these misconceptions that a lot of us understandably have because they're just sort of out there in the culture and we're brought up believing them because we don't have any better alternatives. So they are, I'm going to go through the 4 that we talked about very briefly. Number 1, anger is not a negative emotion, it's a pleasurable one. It means that because it's pleasurable and rewarding, we often unintentionally do things to perpetuate our anger because in the very short term, getting angry feels good. It gives us a sense of self-righteousness or kind of helps alleviate self-esteem issues. Number 2, anger is different than aggression. The most important distinction to make in all of kind of anger psychology. And the idea here is that you want to, instead of focusing on trying to control the anger, you want to validate the anger briefly and then work on controlling the aggression, whether that's physical aggression, verbal aggression, or mental aggression, which usually takes the form of rumination in our own heads. Number 3, things don't cause anger. It's our thoughts about things that lead us to be angry. This really matters because if you think you're too angry, whatever that looks like, what you want to focus on are these 2 kind of primary forms of thinking which tend to generate anger: rumination and unrealistic expectations. And lastly, number 4, venting makes us more angry, not less. So you don't want to let kind of quote unquote processing your anger become a way of procrastinating on actually addressing the real problems in your life assertively. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video helpful. If you'd like to learn more about anger and other aspects of emotional health and well-being, I write a free weekly newsletter called The Friendly Mind, and it goes out every Monday morning. I would love to have you join us and be part of our community. You can find the link to sign up for free in the description below. Thanks.